with everything that we've heard already today, I think it perhaps is just the right time to turn to a slightly different side of the industry, and the one that hasn't really been talked about much, and is really what really goes on in composers' minds in this industry right now. Stephan Eicke has been one of those people who has been a presence in film music festivals, film festivals, and film music concerts for many, many years now. Very familiar face. And as editor-in-chief of Cinema Musica magazine, and a record producer and a writer and all sorts of other things besides, he's been immersing himself in all aspects of this industry for quite some years. Something that, in that case, that drove him to write a book about a rather different side of the industry. The Struggle Behind the Soundtrack is the name of the book. That was written in 2019. Revealed a rather unsettling feeling amongst even the biggest names in film music, particularly about the creative side of the industry. And that's what Stephan will be discussing in this masterclass. So please welcome Stephan Eicke.
Hello. I haven't seen so many maskless faces in so many months. It's really unusual, but you're all very beautiful. So welcome and thank you for being here. Film music, how a business frustrates its miners, doesn't mean the miners, just the emerging or aspiring composers, but really everybody at the end of the food chain, which is mostly the composer. Before we start, a few words about me so that you know who's talking to you. I worked as editor-in-chief of Cinema Musica for nearly 10 years, which was a film music magazine, still exists, now without me. And in fact, when I first met Tommy, I was still doing that. So we've become very, very old. And I stopped doing that, writing about film music, in 2016 because I thought I'd said everything I always wanted to say about film music and there's nothing left for me to say, and it was getting a bit boring. But what then happened there is I continued meeting composers privately for lunches and dinners. I was still living in London and lots of composers came to record film music there. So I would sit down with, people like Joe Kramer or Abel Korzenowski for dinner, and we had some Indian curry, and they individually, off the record, complained about their jobs. And they complained about pretty much the same subjects. And I thought, this is pretty interesting. I mean, why are you complaining? You have this wonderfully creative job. You earn good money. You do what you love. Why are you complaining? And I thought maybe there's a story there. So I went out and researched and ended up writing a book. And I hadn't planned to write a book. It just ended up being one, which was published in 2019. It's called The Struggle Behind the Soundtrack, and which illuminates some of the issues that composers have been complaining about. Now, I should say that whenever I give these kinds of talks, usually for 6 hours or more, at the end of the talks, these students, they raise their hand very timidly, or they approach me afterwards and they say, "Oh, that was depressing." And I don't mean it to be depressing at all. And I don't think it is particularly depressing at all. I think what Andy said is perfectly true. I don't think the film music industry or the film industry or the entertainment industry is worse than any other industry or any other environment. You know, every aspect of life, every job that you do comes with its own sets of problems. Now, I had dinner with a good friend of mine a few days ago, and he came over to my place. He sat on my couch and he started complaining about his job. He said, "Oh, these marketing people, they've no fucking clue what they're talking about." And I listened to his complaints and I said, well, everything that you've been saying doesn't sound particularly bad. It just sounds like the same stuff I've been hearing from other people for decades, and I've experienced myself. And you know that from your job or from the jobs of friends. You know, it's pretty bad everywhere. And John Cleese once said that in every industry or in any environment, there are probably 20% of people who know what they're doing, and the other 80% are completely clueless. And I think that's a fair assessment. So I should preamble my masterclass with the remark that I'm not here to shit on the industry. I don't think it is a particularly bad industry. I don't think it's particularly nefarious. And I'm just here to talk about some of the issues and challenges that I find interesting to talk about, especially for emerging or aspiring composers who should know what the issues can be that they are going to be encountering. And I thought maybe a good idea for today's talk, because we only have limited amount of time, it's not a 6-hour talk, you'll be glad to hear, it's only 50 minutes, is to go through, I mean, imagine you are, and I presume most of you are, composers working in the industry, and then to go through chronologically the steps that you will have to undertake when you work on a project, regardless of whether it's a film or, a TV special or a series or what have you. So we start with money, so the whole negotiating side, package deals, time pressure. We go over to temp tracks, demos, and samples. And I'm going to talk about these issues more in detail. And I've included a few quotes and interviews with composers. I interviewed about 40, 50 composers for my book. So you will hear the insight from them. So let's say you're a composer and let's say you have an agent, and your agent gets approached by a production company or a director or a studio, and they say, we want to work with you the composer. And let's say it's a feature film. The country doesn't matter. Let's say you are based in the US, because I knew that I heard some American voices here. And your agent obviously then negotiates with the studio to say, okay, how much money do you get for your services, and what does this service involve? Now, nowadays, in most cases, they're not, and always exceptions prove the rule. You are being paid a package deal. A package deal means that you are not being paid just for composing, not just for the time you spend crafting a film score or TV score, but also it involves money for composing, orchestrating, copying, recording, and in some cases mixing and mastering. In some cases that's separate, but as I said, there are some liberties to be taken with all of that. So you will have to pay the copyist, the recording engineer, mixing and mastering out of your pocket, the money that you receive before you set out to write the score, the money that is negotiated between your agent and the production company. And I think in this case it's quite interesting to look back and give a bit of perspective on the history, because that it didn't always used to be like that. From the 30s to the 60s, roughly, composers were on staff. They were employed by the film studios, the big studios like Fox and Universal that still exist today. So that means that they were being paid a monthly or even a weekly salary, regardless of how much music they wrote, regardless of how many projects they worked on. They were on staff. There were also staff orchestras. That means that no musicians had to be hired to record a film score. They belonged to the studio. They were on the lot and composers could record with them. Now that changed in the 60s when the whole film industry changed. And composers were then hired on a project-by-project basis, much like today. But they still weren't paid a package deal, they were paid for the composing itself. And in those days, the studios were still run, they had their music departments, and the music departments were run by mostly composers, or at least musicians who kind of knew what they were doing. They knew how much a film score would cost, they knew the specifications, they knew the field. Now, nowadays, you as the composer receive the package deal, and you have to see, okay, how much money can I spend on orchestrating, copying, and recording, mixing, and mastering? Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it comes with a special set of issues, especially if you don't have a good agent. And obviously, this depends on the kind of agent that you have, if you have one. And if you don't have an agent and you're negotiating that yourself, you probably should be well advised to know what you should be aware of. when you negotiate the money that you get for the project. So the issue with package deals is that obviously you negotiate the money before you start writing. Sometimes even you start negotiating the money before you have spotted the film, before you've sat down with the director and decided, okay, this is where we put music and this is how much music we need and this is the kind of music that I as the director want. Meaning the kind of ensemble or how big it's going to be or the style. So that means by the time that you or your agent negotiates the package deal, there are still many unknowns that you just haven't been told by the studio. And this happens frequently. This is not an exception. So you don't know, for example, how much music you have to write, how much music is expected of you. You don't know the ensemble, the size of the orchestra, and the number of changes you will have to do. So let's say you negotiated the package deal and you sit down with the director and the director spots the film with you and he goes into these discussions about the creative aspect of your work and the director says, okay, now we paid you $2,000 for the package deal and I want 120 minutes of music recorded with the London Symphony Orchestra, 94 people, and I need the music in 2 weeks. Well, you won't be able to pay the London Symphony Orchestra with these £2,000 that you've received as the package deal, as an extreme example. So what do? You should tell your agent, make sure to have as few unknowns as possible before you negotiate the amount that you get. So Albert Korzenowski, for example, said, a package deal is an unfair practice for a composer. It's like saying, okay, you have this amount of money, but we won't tell you how much music you have to record. And you as the composer then have to think about, okay, how much money can I spend from this package deal on the various aspects? Now that means that a lot of your time is being spent on logistical work. And Matthew Margeson, the composer who wrote music for Eddie the Eagle, for example, said he really doesn't enjoy that aspect of his business like every other composer because part of his brain is not busy with writing the music, but simply with looking at Excel sheet files and saying, okay, how many musicians do I need? How many sessions will I probably need? How can I book the musicians most efficiently so that I can keep most of the money for myself as my composer fee, for example? Can I afford to fly in my favorite engineer to London for the recording sessions? Now, some of that, if not all of that, is that kind of work is essentially then done by the fixer who books the musicians for you, but the composer or the agent has to go into the initial conversation with the fixer to give them as much information as possible. So you should be prepared. And also, and we'll mention this soon, due to digital editing, now films can be changed until very, very shortly before they will be released in the theaters or streaming or before they go up to distribution. That means you might have to do many more changes very, very late on, sometimes in the middle of recording. You will have to change a few cues. Now, these changes you will have to pay for out of your own pocket. So there are these unforeseens, things that you maybe haven't thought about when you negotiated the package deal, and you might end up paying more money for the copyist or for the recording than you had anticipated. And you really want to avoid that. I mean, I've known of composers who received a lot of money to score big blockbusters and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they had to spend so much that they didn't really get anything for themselves except for the publishing. Because the directors or the producers were there on the recording studio and they said, we don't like that particular cue, we want you to do that kind of change. And that eats up a lot of your money. Plus, of course, it's very, very stressful. So be sure that you set sort of a bag of money aside before you say, okay, this is how much money I want. And we've talked about the time pressure and digital editing. Up until a few decades now. Up until a few decades ago, films were, of course, still cut on a flatbed moviola, and it was negatives and all of that. And now we all work with computers, and editors are able to cut much more quickly and edit much more quickly than ever before. That, of course, means that you can make many more changes very late on, and you as the composer will have to accommodate those changes. And I remember Trevor Jones saying that he wrote 60 versions of a cue because the picture or that particular scene kept changing until the day the music was recorded, and even later than that. So he constantly had to accommodate producers and directors and deliver to them what they wanted. Now, and you'll probably hear this from Daniel Pemberton later on when Tommy speaks to him, that Daniel will have to prepare many versions of a cue. And by the time he has delivered one cue for approval and he's on to the next cue, then a few days or maybe even a few weeks later, feedback comes back for the cue that he delivered a few weeks before, and then he has to go back and change that. So that can be a bit chaotic and eat up a lot of your time as well. And also, and this has always been the case, that's not a new thing, but there have been test screenings, especially in Hollywood, in the big industry, because nobody wants to lose money, and how do we make sure that the film we're producing really is as successful as it can be, and we make a lot of money because we all like money, and we like to keep as much of it as possible. You get in a bunch of people for a bunch of test screenings. So you screen the film to them. And of course, by that point, it isn't finished yet. Oftentimes, the music isn't finished yet. So it's in a very rough state. And you give this audience, you as the production company, give this audience kind of a sheet, and they can say the aspects that they liked about the film and the aspects they didn't like. And they can rate these various aspects on a scale of 1 to 10. And because there are many test screenings, and because sometimes they are very late in the game, you as the composer at the end of the food chain, meaning in post-production, will have to react to these feedback loops in a way. So if the audience says, well, we didn't like the way this character is portrayed, the director might come to you and say, well, we can't really reshoot the film. That's going to be much too expensive. It's much cheaper if you just write a different cue, a different piece of music that makes that character more likable. So then you will have to accommodate that and go back and rewrite the cues that you've already written if the test screenings go badly. If they've gone well, you might be in luck. And of course, you have to accommodate a multitude of voices, because nowadays you have sometimes several studios, you have several producers, and you have several directors. And they all want their say. And sometimes you even have a marketing department on a project, on a successful series or on a film franchise. The marketing department will want to have their say and say, well, we don't like this, we don't like that. I mean, I remember Joe Kramer, for example, when he wrote the music for Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, the head of the marketing department didn't like Lalo Schifrin's Mission Impossible theme, which of course is a problem for a Mission Impossible film. And he forbade the composing team, Joe Kramer and his orchestrators, to use the original Mission Impossible theme. Now, only when Tom Cruise intervened and said, this is a Mission Impossible film, of course we're going to use the fucking Mission Impossible theme, did they relent. And they spent, I think it was about $10,000 on the recording the music for the Mission Impossible trailer alone. And because the head of the marketing department, for many other reasons, didn't like the Mission Impossible theme, they used, I think, only 10 or 15 seconds of the Mission Impossible theme in the actual trailer, and they licensed a lot of other music that cost a lot of money. For them, that's pocket money. But for you as the composer who spends all that money, sometimes out of your own pocket, out of the package deal, that's a lot of money. And actually, I have a clip for you so that I can rest my voice. And it's a clip, Murray Gold talking about an experience he had working on Crossbones that I hope illustrates quite well what I've in many words just tried to say, less eloquently. The music he was asked to write was for a series called Crossbones, which premiered in, I think, 2014. Nobody saw it. It lasted not even one season. It was cancelled after a few episodes. John Malkovich was in it. And it was a show produced by ABC or NBC. And because there were so many producers, so many studios and directors who all wanted to have their say, marketing department and all of that, it really became increasingly difficult for him to just accommodate them and deliver the music on time. So what then happened, he describes in this clip that Uma is going to show to us.
I did this show last year. I went to California. I arrived there and somebody said Walter Parks wants to see you. He used to run Amblin with Steven Spielberg, and he produces Men in Black. And I was like, oh great, okay, I'll go and see him. And it was for their first TV project called Crossbones, which was a pirate show.
Okay.
And we had a great time. I really liked him. We talked. He told me about bringing the Velvet Underground to his college to play. He brought the Doors. And we were talking about, and he said, "I love your music. It's always got so much mischief in it. Not like these very Germanic composers." And then he mentioned somebody and said, it's fine, but there's never any sense of humour. Anyway, so I thought, this is great. And he said, so we're going to film in Puerto Rico, and the production's all based in New York, so you need to... So I started this kind of crazy process with this company, NBC, and, I stayed as obediently sat in my apartment in New York waiting for somebody to contact me, or waiting for somebody to produce an episode of this drama, and nothing ever came. And the clock was ticking. It started to get towards springtime, and then we got word that they were going to close down post-production on this date in May, and we still hadn't had any finished episodes. So I said, so I rang up whoever I could and said, I'm doing this show called Life Story in the UK, and we're recording in June, and there's going to be, probably 4 hours of music in the 6-part show. And they said, well, we're trying to speed things up. And I said, well, it's not a matter of whether you're trying to speed things up. I'm just telling you that I'm not going to be on this show anymore. And they said, well, please don't tell us that. We've gone through so much. And I said, well, but I don't know how does... And so we get to this one episode. It gets to this point where there's 5 weeks and no episode has been scored. And I say...
So how many episodes were there going to be?
10.
10? You would have to score 10 episodes.
Somebody else did score 10 episodes because I took up 1 week deciding that I was going to leave. We just moved. But what I couldn't get over was that everything was built to make the executives at NBC happy. So even if it would have been possible to write the music, we went through one episode and they said, well, now what we have to do is we've got to send this episode, the music, to the first layer of executives. And I said, okay, and then what happens after that? And they said, well, they come back with notes. And then I said, and then we go on to episode 2. I said, no, then you send it to the second layer of executives. And I said, do any of these executives, does the first layer make any difference? Can we not just say it to send it to the second layer? He said, no, we have to comply with the process here. And I said, well, you haven't got time to do that. Can you not see that? And they said, well, nothing changes how even if we have 2 weeks left, we have to do it this way. And I said, well, you're gonna have to do it with a different composer because this is lunacy. So I had to leave it, and that was it was like, I don't know, I don't even know what happened to that show. I don't even know if it was on.
Thank you, Uma. So that's one of my favorite examples because it actually gives such a nice insight into how chaotic these kinds of big productions can be. And somebody did end up scoring 10 episodes in, I think, less than 4 weeks with a massive team. But it's very stressful, you know. It's a situation that you want to avoid. And there was one time that Beltrami was asked to write a score, and it was produced by 2 studios. And both of these studios didn't speak with each other, and they had completely different ideas about what they wanted the score to be like. And he said, well, I'm just going to do the following. I'm just going to write 2 completely different scores for this one film. And he recorded these 2 completely different scores with 2 completely different ensembles in different studios and sent both of them to these 2 production companies. And he said, you figure it out. This is not my battle. And he said it's much easier to write 2 completely different scores once than it is to write every single cue 14 times, which would have happened if he tried to accommodate both and gotten them both into his place. We haven't talked about Hans Zimmer yet, and I'm afraid we don't have all that much time to do that. But Hans Zimmer has made it quite harder for individual composers to accommodate the wishes of producers and directors, because a lot of producers and directors have just become accustomed to the idea that one composer can do this massive amount of work in very short amount of time. It was summarized by Mychael Danna thus: it has become a very hard career, being a film composer, in that you have to do so many things. Writing music is one thing, and you have to be good at managing your staff, because there's no way that one composer could work on a major film by themselves. It's impossible. You need a team, even if it is an orchestrator or technical assistant, because nowadays there's so much technology that we have to work with in order to deliver mock-ups. And then you need to have people skills in order to have these meetings. You need to be able to delegate, because there are so many picture changes that you have to chase, and which is a very common thing now. It is impossible to keep up with the writing, so you have to have other writers on a big movie. 2 good composers can do a big score, but otherwise you need ghostwriters or assistants filling in. The system is set up now that the Hans Zimmer model has become the expected model. And what that means is that what Hans himself said a few years ago, we have very much worked like a firm of architects, one main designer with us all helping each other out. So Hans does not only have his team of assistants or co-composers, but in remote control productions, he has just this huge team of, for example, IT people with great technological skills who make sure that all the technology, the computers, the samples run smoothly. He has people developing samples that sound better than anything that's ever been there before, so that he can wow producers and directors. So this kind of thing for an individual composer working with a very small team is of course not possible in the same way. And then we come to Temp Tracks, which is the next step that you have to deal with when you work on a film or, TV series, what have you. So you've received your money and you already know that you have to accommodate many wishes from producers and directors. And of course, we all work with Temp Tracks now, which means that, on a film that is in production or a TV series that is in production, there are pre-existing cues put underneath the scenes before you start working on them as a composer. And this is done for several reasons. One is just to give the audience or you or even for the director themselves a feeling of familiarity. So if you choose a piece from, for example, The Thin Red Line by Hans Zimmer, that was a successful film. And so the production company or the director subconsciously or even consciously think, well, we can probably repeat that success by putting a piece of music, a well-known piece of music, under that film that was very, very successful. And it gives you a sense of security and control, especially for directors or producers who don't have a musical vocabulary. They can communicate quite easily then, with the help of a temp track, what they want for you as the composer to do. And of course, it's much easier to edit to music. Now, this is important for the editor, because by the time the film is in the early stages of editing, or maybe even in the late stages of editing, you are still working on the music. Maybe you haven't even started writing the music yet. So it's helpful for the editor to have some piece of music that they can work with, just to develop a rhythm. And it's also important for test screenings, because by the time the first test screenings are organized, the music isn't finished yet, the final score. And maybe you haven't anything to show except some very rough demos for a few cues. So what does the production company do? They choose temp tracks that help give the film a feeling that they want the film to convey. And Rachel Portman gave this example when she worked on a film called A Dog's Purpose. There was a music editor who worked on the temp music for 6 months. He worked for half a year trying to craft a temp score that worked as well as possible with the film. So he was given hundreds of cues from the director and from the production company. These are the cues that we like for these scenes. You figure it out. And you, as the music editor, then try to give the film, and certainly the eventual score that you as the composer write, a cohesive structure, if possible, some kind of concept. And you try to make the individual temp tracks work with the individual scenes. So you try to choose temp tracks that rise and fall, that hit the action on the screen, and that give you as the composer kind of a direction of where the production company and the director want to go in. So Rachel Portman then had to follow the temp track, which had been worked on for half a year, as closely as possible, because by that point, of course, everybody as part of the production had gotten used to the temp track. And the film had been screened, and it tested very well with the test audience. And of course, if it tests well with the test audience, nobody wants you to change anything, because it can only get worse. So for Rachel, it was a nightmare, because she thought, I have no freedom whatsoever. I have to follow every single temp track, and there's nothing creative for me to do as a composer. And then you have to deliver demos and samples of your own music, of course. And demos and samples have made life for composers quite a lot easier in many, many ways. So essentially, they are a very good thing. You are able to just convey your ideas and suggestions to the directors and producers much more clearly than you would have been able to if you just sat at the piano or just described your music with words. Now you can play your music to the director with very good samples, and the director will say, oh yeah, I like that, or I don't like that, or let's go in a different direction. So the communication has improved vastly because of demos and very good samples. But there are also a few traps that a composer can fall into when working with demos and samples. And that just go with the business. I mean, for example, it's tempting to provide or go with a lack in detail when delivering a demo or sample. And Alan Silvestri gives a good example for that when he said, there can be this tendency to not deliver the level of detail in the piece you might had. You've been sitting there with pencil and paper. The voice going on in one's head says, okay, that shows what the idea is there, but you're not really going there and taking a hard look at the orchestration. So that means you're very, very busy, you're in post-production, the film is changing around the clock, and you say, oh God, I need to deliver this one piece, so I need to deliver a demo. And you say, right, this is my idea, this is the piece that I'm going to present to the director, this will get the idea across, this is good enough, and then I can work on it further. Well, you might not get the chance to work on it further, because if you present it to the director or producer and they say, great, we love it, it's amazing, don't change a note, then you will not be able to change a note. And that, of course, has repercussions for the orchestrator, or even for yourself if you're orchestrating your own music, because the orchestrator then has no freedom whatsoever. They have to stick as closely to your demo, which you'd conceived as a sketch, essentially, just a rough sample, as possible. So the refined work that goes into the piece that is eventually going to be recorded by the orchestra is severely limited. It's not like it used to be, where the composer gives to the orchestrator 4 or 5 staffs and says, okay, make this sound as nice as possible by the orchestra or by even an electronic equipment, and make it so that it's very well playable, that musicians actually enjoy playing this piece. Well, that might not be possible because, you know, the piece that you are giving to your orchestrator before it's going to be recorded has already been signed off on by the production company and by the director. So don't change anything. And the orchestrator, Nan Schwartz, summarized it like this. She said, you have to turn in a demo and get it approved before you can go ahead. Now everyone is doing these mock-ups, and then the mock-up has to be close to the final product in terms of the orchestra, so that the director has an idea. And then the uneducated composer falls in love with his sound and doesn't want his orchestrator to improve it or do anything different. Plus, they don't want to trick the director because the director has already signed off on a certain sound. So be aware of that. And there's a good reason why Lorne Ball, for example, provides demos and samples and presents them to the director and the production company that are as close to the final product, as close to the final idea as possible. And by that time, he will have, in the best case, already spoken with his orchestrator and worked on that cue with assistants and orchestrators to make it just as beautiful as possible, because he knows that he might not be able to go back on the cue and work on it further. And there's a reason why Lorne Ball, for example, is as successful as he is. It's not because he's a particularly good composer, but because he knows what you have to do in order to satisfy the production company and the director. And this is nearly everything. I wanted to leave some time for questions. But I want to close with the quote from Mychael Beltrami, which summarizes all the issues that we've talked about in the course of this presentation, who said that most composers are anxious people to begin with. Everybody I know, except a couple, have pretty bad insomnia. Sitting at your desk for long hours at a time is not good for your body. Staring at screens doesn't make for the most healthy career either. So somehow your body keeps you healthy while you have the stress, but sometimes when the stress lets off, you have a tendency to get sick. And I think it's important to remember that composers by nature, because they're creative people, are very sensitive. And we work in, as somebody said, I think it was Andy even who mentioned it previously, that it is a creative industry, but it's also the most commercial industry, because production companies, producers and directors want to make money. So how do you accommodate that? Working as a creative in a very just commercial environment. And I think you need to find ways that you can deal with that the best you can by, first of all, being aware of the challenges that you might face. And then there are individual tips and tricks that you can use to make your work as pleasant as possible. Mychael Danna said whenever he's working on a project that is especially stressful, he just reads a lot of books about the Vietnam War, because he feels, oh, this makes my life sound so much better. It's not that stressful after all. But as I said, I don't want to discourage anybody from taking that path, because it is a tremendously enriching experience, and working as a creative in an environment that is commercial but that pays your bills and you can suggest ideas and develop new music, that's a wonderful thing. So I hope nobody's going to raise their hand and say, boy, that was depressing, because that's not what I wanted to convey at all. But just summarize some of the issues that have been talked about off the record, now on the record. And if you want to read more about it, because there are many more aspects to that we haven't been able to speak about, of course, buy my book. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, if we still have time, then just go ahead. No, that's probably a good thing, isn't it? Yeah, just praise me.
Yeah, hello. Actually, to contribute to what you said about package deals, as an agent myself, they are a blessing when it comes to small projects and when you are very straightforward from the beginning, when you are on projects. Because they have a limited budget, and more or less the indie projects, they know what they want, approximately. So it can be, if someone is very good in managing costs, it can be quite a blessing because they tell you, actually, we just need 20 minutes of music, very minimal. You can agree on that from the beginning, and you only have 10,000 euros. So immediately in your head, you can say, okay, I can spend 3,000 recording 5 French musicians, and 7 I put in my pocket. It becomes a big problem in big projects. But for small projects in the independent world, it's not a bad thing, really.
Yeah, I think
And
it's
I'm
fair
saying
to
that
say.
because 9 out of 10 deals I'm doing are package deals either way.
I think generally speaking, the bigger the project is you're working on, the more difficult it is, like with everything in life.
Anyone? The girls left, so we can continue.
Okay. Who wants to tell some jokes? Good. Everybody's sufficiently depressed? Excellent. I've done my work. I think everybody's full, Uma. Excellent. Then thank you very much. And if you want to approach me later on, I'm sticking around until Sunday. So I'm always there to give autographs. And that's a joke. Thank you.